Greetings, traveler of hours. I am the Watcher. Tonight we walk the old Celtic roads. Latines curling art and hill fort rings. The bronze calendar at Coligny, river offerings and boundary shrines, Epona and Lugus under many names, Torcs of plated light on sea-cliff hoards, kingship's bargains kept by the bog, and midwinter sun threading Bóinne. Fact-rooted and softly told. Before we drift, tell me, where are you listening from, and what time is it there? I read every note before I rest. Tonight there is a rumor in the room. A seal that cooled too soon, a footstep pausing behind a tapestry, a small door in a wall that swears it has no doors. I carry 3 keys, iron, bone, and amber, and one is warm, as if a promise has just changed its mind. If you listen, you can hear the lock consider us. If my voice brings you comfort, follow me and drift beside me through the ages. Let the room soften. Let night draw close like a shawl. Unclasp the jaw, smooth the brow, let the tongue rest. If thoughts arrive, letters, ladders, keys, nod to them and let them walk on. Breathe with me, gentle as a tide at dusk. Inhale through the nose for 4, 1, 2, 3. Exhale for 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. This is Sleepy Watcher. Quiet history for drowsy hearts. When oaths change coats. When ink keeps a secret. When a door opens to a different morning. Another breath. Inhale. 1, 2, 3, 4. Exhale. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I will keep the lamp. When you are ready, choose a key, and we will lift the curtain and step softly into the older rooms. The door is waiting. Now let us begin. I move quietly along roads that are older than memory, where carts once sang on iron hoops and cattle bells rang slow as heartbeats. I pass hilltops ringed with banks and ditches, and river fords where offerings sank like seeds. Here the land keeps a ledger, not of dream alone, but of metal and wood, tooth and braid, slate and bronze. If my voice brings you ease, you may drift beside me through these hours. We will follow what can be held in the hand and named by its place, and let the hush between the facts be the room where wonder lies. Chapter 1, A Lake and a Pattern. From Hallstatt to Tène. I come first to water, to a lakeshore where timber piles once anchored a world of salt, trade, and hard-working craft. Long before the great roads of empire reached these valleys, folk here trimmed planks, cured meat, boiled brine to crystals, and set their lives to the rhythm of lake and mountain. From that older horizon of Hallstatt ways, a new language of ornament rises, not spoken in words, but chased in metal. In the last centuries before foreign legions pressed west, metalworkers along another lakeshore found a grammar of curve and countercurve. Spirals open like ferns, tendrils coil back upon themselves, and the space between lines is as carefully tended as the lines. A sword hilt bears the flowing design. A scabbard mouth unfurls into twin volutes. Brooches clasp cloaks with the confidence of river eddies. Those who study such things will name the style for the place where many finds lay sleeping, a lakeside called Tène. Those who lived it need no schoolroom word. They know the motif by touch, by the feel of a graver easing into bronze and the way light pools in a freshly cut groove. Traders carry this pattern west as readily as salt and story. Across passes and along river corridors, it learns new dialects while keeping its grammar. On a headland above a cold sea, a woman wears a brooch whose curves echo the lake far away. In a forested upland, a boy fingers the spiral on his father's scabbard and knows he belongs to a larger road. Opposite rise, fortified places with gates and planned streets, where craftsmen shape this bright language for those with cattle, clients, or courage to pay for it. There are fairgrounds where amphorae of wine change hands for hides and metals. There are smithies where iron sings against iron, and the smith's hearth keeps its own calendar by charcoal and demand. The new style is not only embellishment. It is a way of thinking about power and motion. A straight line does not boast here. Curves hold authority as vines do, wrapping, returning, completing their promise. Even the long sword, workmanlike and direct, accepts at its mouth a whirl of ornament that turns the first hard inch of iron into a doorway. A warrior lifting such a blade steps through a pattern before he steps into danger. He knows it, and so do those who watch. The people who wear these things and build these places mark themselves not as a single nation, but as a chorus. They speak related tongues, bargain with kinship and pledge, burn their dead in some valleys and bury them in others. Yet the eye unites them. A mirror's back bears an S-scroll. A shield boss blooms into a tri-spiral. A horse's bit ends in paired serpent heads. When a stranger arrives, one need only look to the clasp at the shoulder and the line worked there to know the roads he has walked. As seasons turn, movement binds the west to the east. From the lake belt come ideas and artisans. From the ocean edges come tin and stories of land's end. In the middle hangs a web of names that will shift with time. Tribes whose titles are stamped on coins and remembered by rivers. Some hilltop towns crown plateaus with stone revetments. Others trust timber and earth, renewing the palisade when winter has used it hard. Cattle thread the lanes at dusk like beads on a string. Smoke rises from kilns where potters gamble on heat and air. I pause at a ridge where a rampart cuts the skyline. The bank bears the signature of careful engineering. A timber lattice filled with earth and stone. A gate with cheeks set to manage passage. Inside, the plots are measured and repeated, so that a potter may know where the bronzesmith keeps his hearth, and a stranger can find the market by following noise and smell. The granaries stand a little apart, raised to lift grain from damp and mouths from temptation. Children run where carts leave ruts. Elders gather where shadows make a reading of the weather. Outsiders call them barbarians and think of hair and noise, but the ground refutes that insult with order. The music of this age is not only voice and lyre. It is the rhythmic clink of hammer on stake as a shield rim is fixed. It is the hush when a scabbard's leather is burnished with fat and ash. It is the bright whisper as a graver cuts a second line beside a first, creating depth where none had been. This is the sound of identity made tangible. A woman lifting a mirror catches the river curl of the design behind the glass and smiles because she knows what the curl means. To the east, a caravan creaks with amphory. They bear wine from vineyards the lake folk have never seen, and each jar is a bargain yet to be named. The taste of wine marries the old taste of mead, and the stories of heroes learn new adjectives to describe the warmth in the belly. Amphory pile broken near the fairground after feast days. Their shards a future field of study. The broken pieces will one day tell a scholar that the world was wider than the hilltop view. Below the ridge, the river keeps its own counsel. It has learned to receive more than fish. At certain seasons, spears and swords enter the current not for loss but for exchange. Iron given to water, favor asked in return. Some enter bent, so that no hand may wake them for common need. Some enter sharp, singing to the silt. A child is told that the river has a long memory and a generous ear. The child learns to cross respectfully and to lift a small gift to the flow. A pin, a bead, a whispered promise to be braver next year. So the pattern that was born at a lakeshore becomes the sign of a horizon. It does not erase older marks. It entwines them. A Bronze Age spiral in a tomb carving meets the new curve on a brooch and nods in recognition. A shepherd's knot becomes a goldsmith's motif, and a woodcarver's habit of following grain teaches a metalworker how to court light. By the time distant power begins to edge along the rivers with measured roads and disciplined boots, the West has already declared itself in metal. Those boots will notice. They will copy some shapes, translate some names, tax some markets, and misunderstand much. But the curved language will endure, tucked into the borders of newer empires, waiting for anyone who cares to listen with the eyes. And I, who move lightly through the ledger of the land, note the places where the earth has given back its receipts. Lakeshore finds, hilltop plans, ornaments that repeat a grammar across days and distances. If you rest your head now, let the curve hold you as a riverbank holds water. Sleep may come on a spiral, returning to where it began and finding it changed. As style becomes story becomes memory. Chapter 2, The Bronze Calendar at Coligny. I have learned to trust the quiet testimony of metal. In a town of hedged fields and river light, Workers once riveted thin bronze plates into a broad tablet, and upon that surface they cut the breathing of the sky. The letters are the straight capitals favored by the empire, yet the words are of the local tongue. The tablet lay hidden for a long sleep and rose again in fragments, enough to carry a whole design. A cycle not of 1 year only, but of 5, set out as carefully as a surveyor's grid. The form is grand and orderly. Imagine a table of 16 slender columns and 4 long rows, the months marching down each column in regular file. 2 extra months appear as half columns, tucked like leaves into a book. Intercalations meant to reconcile the moon's wandering with the sun's steadiness. In all, there are 62 months to complete the round of 5 years. Each ordinary year holds 12 of them. The extra months arrive not by whim but by plan, so that night counts and seed counts keep faith with one another. The names of the months are not borrowed. They belong to the land that spoke them. Simonios, Domanios, Riveros, Anagantios, Agronios, Cutios, Gymonios, Simavasanios, Equos, Elambivios, Idrinios, and Cantlos. 2 seasons face one another across the table. A summer led by Simonios, and a winter led by Gymonios. Even in the names the weather speaks. Simonios carries the brightness of summer in its root. Gymonios carries the hush of winter. When the eye travels from the one to the other, the year divides cleanly, as folk memory long maintained it. A light half and a dark half, each with 6 months to its honor. The months themselves are not all equal. Some possess 30 days, others 29. This is not a mistake, nor a slovenly keeping of time, but a precise accommodation to the moon's true habit. The makers mark the difference with a simple code. Certain month headings bear a sign that means good or auspicious, and their days begin as favored. Certain others bear a sign that says not good, and their days begin plain. There are 6 of each in every lunar year, with the lion's share of favor resting on summer, when fields, herds, and traveling markets require luck to flow. A single month, Equos, is allowed to be either 29 or 30 as need demands, a flexible joint to keep the cycle honest. Look closer, and you will see that the months are divided in half, as if the engraver wished to hold the moons by their 2 hands. Between the halves, the letters of a single word recur. Atonix, the renewal, reminding any reader that a dark fortnight yields to brightness. Within the days themselves, small signs mark night and day, and certain clusters of days carry repeating notes that wander from month to month like migrating birds. The rhythm is evident, a gathering of auspicious hours toward the brighter half, a cautioning hush where the moon thins, a confidence regained when the returning light is named. On one line of Simonios a particular marking stands out, clear and brief like a bell. It says, in the language of the tablet, the 3 nights of Simonios. Set on the 17th day of that summer month, the phrase is the only feast named outright upon the bronze. Its position shifts in the solar round depending on the intercalations, yet within the lunar scheme it does not stray. Readers have argued which custom those 3 nights remember, and whether their echo carries forward into later tales of thresholds and visitation. The bronze itself offers no rumor. It simply keeps the date. The workmanship tells its own history. The plates were once joined by rows of rivets. Small round holes pierce the surface where pegs may have rested to indicate the day. The letters have a practiced, provincial hand. Not the angular severity of a court inscription, yet steady, deliberate, and used to public notice. The words they spell are not Latin but Gaulish. In the margins of the months, abbreviations repeat with the confidence of a clerk who knows his system. A letter for night, a sign for a favorable day. Short sequences that announce festival runs or special observances and then, in the year after an intercalation, appear 1 month earlier, as if gently tugged backward to preserve the spacing of sacred time. I pause at the thought of the intercalary months, the 2 half columns that make the count work. They do not boast descriptive names on the surviving plates. Their business is not poetry but repair. The first sits at the beginning of the great table, before Simonios, like an extra breath gathered before a song. The second lives deeper in the sequence. Together they arrive roughly every 2.5 years across the 5-year course, easing moon and sun into the same stride. Without them, sowing would slip against weather, and the signals of feast and bargain would drift across the countryside like smoke in a shifting wind. The practical uses of such a thing are plain to anyone who has promised a delivery date or planned a fair. A wheelwright does not swear to finish a cart sometime after the lambing, but on the 10th day of a named month. A community does not prepare fires to bless a herd on mere instinct, but on the first day after a renewal mark. A judge in a sacred grove appoints litigants to return after a fixed number of nights, and when they do, every onlooker agrees that the counting was fair, for the tablet in the meeting hall told them so. The calendar is governance without garrison, the steady persuasion of agreed time. Trade learns its way by these marks. Amphorae from far vineyards arrive at predictable intervals. The market understands when there will be hands enough to unload and buyers enough to drink. Smiths adjust their order books to auspicious runs, not because they are credulous, but because their customers are. Shepherds read the brighter half-months as an open gate for shearing and dipping. Carpenters move their timber on days noted as favorable to travel. The old advice, "Do not wrestle the moon," becomes an office practice, a rural economy's quiet rule. And yet there is tenderness beneath all this efficiency. The bronze shows a people unwilling to let the night bully them. They name the return of light in the very middle of the dark. They mark, month after month, the places where luck is expected to gather, the days when caution is wise, the hours when night's letter takes precedence. Even those who could not read a line would have learned to recognize the pegs, the columns, the rhythm of intercalations. Such tools do not insist on literacy. They teach familiarity. The place of finding lends further weight. The tablet rose from the soil not far from the old hill above the rivers where the city of Lugdunum once minted power. Alongside the calendar, fragments of a bronze god were lifted war-shaped, spear in hand, the presence of the dominion that had set its letters on the local time. The calendar belongs to that shared horizon. Local language, imperial script, rural need, urban craft. In another valley, at a double sanctuary to the east, smaller scraps of a related table were found, bearing the same habits of notation. This was not a singular novelty. It was a style of keeping time that had traveled. Consider how children would have learned it. A mother shows her daughter the month row and the little word between halves, and together they say it aloud. Renewal. A grandfather taps the peg holes with an awl and explains how a marker moves at dawn, so the whole household agrees on the day. A youth, newly bound to a smith, memorizes the sequence of months as he would the order of tools along the bench. When the first intercalary plate is unrolled and fixed in place again, the change is not frightening. It is the return of a known companion who visits as reliably as a tax collector and leaves the books balanced. In Simonios, while the sun holds long, contracts stretch, caravans gather, and games are planned on broad meadows. In Giamonios, while frost speaks, repairs are scheduled, cattle are counted, and the reckoning of stores is set down against the far half of winter. Between them stand the middle months with their own textures, the invocations of Cutios, the cold implied by Agronios, the horses that lend their name to Equos, the stags suggested by Elambivios, the heat hinted within Adrinios, the chant or tally that breathes in Cantlos. Etymologies may be debated in the halls of learning, but the practical sense would have been obvious in field and town. There is a further sweetness in the way the calendar binds the visible moon to ordinary promises. On certain runs of days the notations cluster, then appear again a month earlier after an intercalation, as if time itself were stepping back to set its heel firmly before walking on. A feast run marked with a small sacred word is not allowed to drift forward into a less fitting season. It is drawn backward to preserve the proper light. The bronze will not preach doctrine, but it enforces harmony without complaint. I have watched many peoples keep time. Some carve tall stones to hold the sun on a single morning in the depth of winter. Some reckon by water dripped from a measuring bowl. Here, the keeping is a partnership between sky and craft. The moon gives her uneven month. The engraver gives a column with enough generosity to absorb that unevenness. The sun walks the fields, and the community nudges the lunar count with intercalary grace so that the harvest is not promised to a wrong week. Nothing is left to grand theory. Everything is tuned to use. When readers of later centuries unfurl copies and tracings, They argue fine points. Whether the month begins at the quarter, how the lucky and unlucky days relate to night's marking, whether the great cycle aimed to mesh with the metonic wisdom known elsewhere. The bronze is patient with them all. It keeps its silence, but it rewards the attentive with pattern after pattern. Half-months named for renewal, seasons bounded by summers and winters months. A single variable month acting as a hinge, 2 intercalations spaced to restore the pace, and a feast of 3 nights named plainly where all can see it. In the end, a shepherd or a smith would understand the calendar as well as a scholar does, because both want the same gift, to know what to do and when. So I tell you this, as the night drifts on, the people who made those lines married exactitude to belonging. Time was not a tyrant to them. It was a covenant. Together they agreed to call the months by their own names, to give the moon her due, to correct her wanderings with courtesy, and to gather in festival when the bronze said the nights were 3 and joined. If you rest now, let the steady grid of that tablet hold your breathing. Let the renewal between halves be yours as well. When you wake, your day will have a name, and that will be enough. Chapter 3 Shrines at the Frontier, Gournay and the River Gifts. Boundaries make people careful. Where one community's pasture met another's hunt, the ground often held a place set slightly aside from daily use. A rectangle of ditch and palisade, a single gate that taught the body to slow, a cleared court where posts stood like a smaller, more obedient forest. I have walked such places when the corn was high and when the fields lay open and stubble pale. Even in sleep, the earth keeps the plan. At a frontier in the North Country, the sanctuary of Gournay took form as a measured enclosure. A ditch drew an oblong, its spoil heaped into a bank, and within that bank wooden posts rose in steady spacing. The gate faced the light of early day. Inside, the center kept a patch of packed soil for the business of right, and along the inner face of the palisade a walkway allowed processions to make their circuit like the moon's own path, close to the protective timber. What came into that space did not leave in the same way it entered. Spears arrived straight and went home bent. Swords that had walked behind shields in muddy fields took one more use upon them. They knelt to the post and were folded at the hilt as deliberately as a book closed on a final chapter. Shield boards, cracked and mute, were set aside from the press of use and leaned against the fence to weather into silence. In pits and at the foot of posts, bones rested, cattle foremost, for a sanctuary eats as surely as a household, and the remains of shared meat teach fellowship even as they perfume the memory of a day with smoke. The pattern did not belong to a single afternoon. It was a habit that revisited the place as seasons passed. There were days of gathering, men and women, elders and youths, those carrying the creak of harness and those who had no cause to own a horse. They came with tokens taken in conflict, with oaths to settle, with thanks for safe return, and with petitions for calm. There were days of repair when carpenters lifted new rails to posts and tamped fresh clay into the track where feet had carved a groove. There were quieter days when the sanctuary lived like a granary, holding wealth that no single hand might take. A store of prestige deliberately removed from the counting of any household ledger. The rite of unmaking was the heart of it. Iron that could defend a boundary was turned to a boundary's memory. A spearhead reversed, a blade doubled, a shaft broken. Each act told the community that the power once carried by that tool would not answer to private quarrel any longer. The sanctuary's air took it in and made it harmless. I have heard the sigh that follows such gestures, the relief that spreads when a village sees danger curbed by consent rather than merely by strength. Not all offerings rested within fences. Beyond the palisade, the river kept its own sanctuary. Across the old world of curving motifs, people had long spoken with water in a grammar of gifts. Where a ford narrowed the flow to ankle or to knee, the current received iron with an eagerness that seemed almost personal. Swords entered gleaming, turned their edges to the sun one last time, and vanished. Some bore dents in their spines where the blow of unmaking had been struck. Some were still whole and quick, as if the river's spirit could be trusted to do the folding on its own time. A bronze plate with a spiral boss rode the current once, drifted to a calm on the gravel, and took on that dark silt sheen that makes old metal look as if it had been grown rather than made. A helmet rim kissed pebbles and grew a border of limescale that no smith would waste time imitating. A horse's bit rang against a stone and fell quiet forever. The river took them all and did not argue. In drought years it gave a few back as a reminder that it had listened. On the far side of the grain lands, I remember the pillars of a southern hill, where sculptors gave stone the shape of a gate that welcomed heads. Their work was plain in its purpose, yet the mood of the place was not fury but solemn rank. Socketed stones waited for the skulls of the honored dead, trophies of victory, kin or foe displayed with the same certainty that the head is the seat of sight and breath. Elsewhere nearby a wall bore a carved figure who leans upon the branch of a sacred tree and watches over his court. These communities kept counsel with bone as they did with bronze. The look of the shrine dignified the practice, framing mortality as a sign rather than a shock. Further north, on a terrace above a river, posts and long rails once supported something more startling to later eyes: the ordered display of human remains and arms in a composition so formal that it outlived the weather in the memory of the soil. The ground held deposits of bones arranged with care, the residue of a victory shaped into a lasting sign. Spears stood like reeds around the place. Sword fragments lay where they had been placed, unlifted, untouched. If a people wished to tell their children that danger had been met and turned, they could point to that constellation of iron and bone and say, "Here is when the boundary held." I have seen such spaces used for peace as well as pride. A new marriage takes its first steps beneath the gate while the elders look on. A quarrel over cattle enters by one path and leaves by another, settled not by force of hand but by recitation of law and the exchange of goods. The sanctuary lends gravity to speech and then keeps the witness of its posts. The smell of charcoal, the herb hung to sweeten the air, the white of chalk scattered to mark a path. These small senses remain in the mind long after the names have thinned. When strangers write of these places, they often dwell on edge and spectacle. I remember the household work that girded them. Someone had to bring milk and bread, to sweep the walkway of the palisade, to tend the fire for cooking the meat that paired with great days. Someone strung ropes to keep little ones from wandering too close to the open ditch. Someone replaced a gate pin, whittling the hard wood so that the hinge would swing sweetly. A sanctuary is not built of climax. It is held together by maintenance, and maintenance is love in its plainest uniform. The river gifts teach gentleness in a fierce world. To consign a fine sword to water is to declare that not every treasure must be hoarded. To offer a piece of worked art with its spirals catching the last sun is to admit that beauty can be relinquished on purpose. Those who watched such acts leaned forward and learned a civic lesson without a single tablet to instruct them. Property is not always possession. Value can be passed from hand to commonwealth, from warrior to water, from moment to memory. Children took from these gatherings the fixed points of the year. They counted the days until the cattle would be led between fires on the meadow beyond the ditch. They knew when the river ran low enough to wade and when it fattened and murmured a warning to small ankles. They learned that the sanctuary asked clean faces and clean hands, and that jokes were saved for the path away home. They learned to tell straight iron from iron deliberately curbed and to keep their fingers from the sharp out of respect as much as fear. There came a time in the life of the sanctuary when its own closing became a rite. Posts were pulled or cut low and covered. The ditch received not only broken arms but also the tools of its caretakers, as if to say that the work had finished and the place should rest as honorably as any elder. A last feast laid bones in a final layer. A last procession of the walkway taught knees and hips the old turn for the last time. When earth took the timber, grass wrote a new script over the plan. Centuries would pass before plow and spade sketched the old lines again into daylight. Meanwhile, the rivers continued their quiet priesthood. Long after a community's enemies had learned new names, the currents kept their archive. A fisherman's hook lifted a brooch that once held a cloak on a cold midwinter night and made it wink again after an age in shadow. A dredge raised a shield facing that still looked ready to catch sun and spear in the same day. Each reappearance did more than excite curiosity. It restored a piece of the conversation between the living and the water that had never truly ceased. Not every deposit was the fruit of victory. There were thank offerings that followed safe birth, safe travel, a healed limb, the return of a strayed child. There were pleas cast into the flow from those who had no other coin to spend, a pin or a bead sent with a breath of hope. I have watched older women close their eyes at the ford and let such small treasures fall between their fingers, trusting the secrecy of the current to carry their concerns to whatever hears beneath the surface. Their faces arrive in my memory as steadily as any warrior's boast. In the greater weave of the West, these sanctuaries and gifts to water sat well with other habits. Hills bore mounds that answered to the sun at midwinter dawn, their passages filling with light as if the year itself were a guest. Fields were ringed with banks not only for defense but to mark the place where a fair would be raised with stalls, horses, songs, and sworn bargains. Trees with long lives stood at the center of sacred lots, their shade holding counsel when judgment had to be delivered without heat of anger. The language of offering did not rely on one grammar alone, but the bending of iron and the feeding of rivers were among its clearest verbs. I think of a particular day when the sanctuary gate admitted two parties moving with evident caution. One brought a spear blunted at the tip and wrapped in cloth. The other brought a small carved figure of a horse and a basket of barley. Words were exchanged without haste. Hands gestured to the posts and to the river path. In the end, the wrapped spear was unfolded, its wood shaft lifted free, its head kissed to timber and then bent across the rail with a clean, practiced stroke. The little horse went to a niche cut into the inner face of the palisade, and the barley went down to the ford, where it joined the flow in a long, bright sleeve. No one cheered. No one needed to. The rite had done its work. It had taken heat out of a quarrel and given both parties a way to remember themselves as neighbors. From time to time, people complain that such places memorialize conflict. I answer that they domesticate it. A weapon folded at a shrine is a boast made modest. A skull housed in carved stone is a life acknowledged as having borne meaning, even if once it belonged to a foe. A shield in a river is a word for restraint written in bronze. Children who grow up reading these signs become adults who know how to step away from fury without losing face. When empire's roads reached these frontiers and new gods were set upon pedestals by talented hands, the sanctuaries learned a different timbre. Letters carved in a foreign mode stood beside old symbols. The river took coins stamped with new rulers' profiles along with the old spiral plates. Yet the undermood did not change. People still needed a public room for gratitude, for the burial of sharpness, for the placing of precious things where private fingers could not snatch them back. The fence might be rebuilt in a different pattern. The grammar remained. Toward the end of this chapter's road, I descend again to a ford at dusk. The sky has the color of hammered copper cooling at the rim of a hearth. The stones underfoot are trustworthy. I draw from the fold of memory a pin with a little curl at its head and let it fall into the murmuring bed. It is not mine to keep. It never was. The water carries it without splash, and I learn once more the sanctuary's oldest lesson, that giving something up on purpose makes a person larger, not poorer. I turn back toward the palisade, though it exists now only as a rise in the grass and a faint change in the soil where posts once drank rain. The gate that faced the light remembers how mornings looked when the first feet approached with quiet minds. In that remembering lies continuity. Tomorrow the chapter will move on to a headland by the sea and a ring of plated light. But for tonight, let the river keep what was entrusted to it, and let the boundary rest in peace bought by careful hands. Chapter 4, The Oath at Snettisham, a torc of plated light. Coast air tastes of salt and iron on this headland, where fields slope down to a tide that travels like a slow animal. Here the earth once kept a store not of grain but of brightness. Spades have lifted from this place rings for the throat, some torn, some whole, some hidden together as if kin. Among them slept a single neckring whose making still quiets the room. A torc with light braided into it so deftly that the eye thinks it hears music. The metal is pale gold with a breath of silver in it. A marriage bright enough for a feast and strong enough to outlast a lifetime. Many fine strands were twisted first into cords and then those cords laid again into a thicker rope, so that the surface reads like a plowed field in miniature, furrow speaking to furrow. At either end, swelling terminals hold reliefs as tender as leaf vein and as sure as a seal. The hollow work is clever, the joins discreet. A craftsperson of deep patience taught the metal to lie as if it had grown that way. I remember the feel of such rings when they were new. They are heavy enough to ask the shoulders to share the load, and yet balanced so that the weight declares dignity rather than pain. When the neck receives one, the circle sits just above the collarbones, bright as a small horizon, to where it is to be read from a distance. Even in firelight, even in rain, the plate catches and releases the day like water over a weir. This ring was not a common ornament. It belonged to the last generations before legions pressed their roads into this coast, when the people of these flats and woods counted wealth in cattle, coin, clients, and the oaths others swore to them. A torc here was more than treasure. It was office, favor, and the memory of alliances wound into metal. When a guest crossed the threshold and the ring shone at the host's throat, every bargain spoken beneath that roof took on a steadier color. The headland remembers more than a single ring. Hoards rested nearby. Gatherings of neck rings and bracelets, twists and fragments. Bright circles stored in the soil by hands that meant to return or to please what listens underground. Some pieces had been bent on purpose, as if their promise had been honored and then gently dismissed from service. Some lay whole, nested together like serpents sleeping. Nearby, coins of the local style once crowded a pot, their faces repeating the familiar horse that ran in the minds of the people here. The land that yielded them later had belonged to a tribe who would be named in foreign histories when rebellion flared. But in the days when these rings were hidden, the names spoken were nearer and older, carried on kinship and plume of smoke. I have stood at feasts where such rings presided. Oaths were taken not by parchment but by hand upon gold. A leader would lift the torc just enough to touch it and then lay a palm on the guest's shoulder. Words were slow and unadorned. The weight at the throat made them so. If a dispute threatened to spoil the meat, the ring kept temper honest. If a marriage was declared, it gathered the pledges like a circlet of vows about the couple's necks. And when death came, there were nights when the ring was set on a cushion beside the bier, to say that authority might pass, but the pattern of belonging remained. The workmanship had its own grammar, taught from master to apprentice over long winters. First the drawing of wire, patient and even, so that each strand had the same temper and brightness. Then the twisting in small groups, chords that sang softly against the fingers. Then the laying of cord upon cord, the weight growing, the line tightening into a rope with no loosened hairs, no gap for shadow to hide in. Terminals were cast in molds carved with spirals and palmettes that remembered the lakelands far to the east. Chasing and punching brought the relief to life. Burnishing invited the sun. At the last, the closure was made so that a practiced hand could open and close the circle without struggle. Yet a stranger would search in vain for the trick. Why were so many rings sleeping here? The ground refuses to choose one answer. Some were offerings to seal a vow with the earth itself, a tithe of brightness given so that the community's luck might be banked in soil. Some were wealth hidden in a season of fear, when neighboring power grew too curious. Some were the stock of a goldsmith's house, parts and trials, damaged pieces meant to be melted and born again when time allowed. The truth could be all of these at once, because a headland can hold several kinds of silence. The torc that now draws the most breath when it is shown to the light does not boast alone. Across this island other neck rings have risen from fields and fens. Some thick and plain as rope, meant for daily declaration. Some fine as a garland, meant for holy days. Some so massive that they seem to harness the wearer to the very idea of rule. All share a conviction that a circle at the throat binds more than metal to skin. It binds person to people. I think of the day it was first lifted from the mold of dirt. The spade struck something that sang rather than thudded, and careful hands traded tools for fingers. Soil released a curve, then a swelling end bright beneath its tarnish, then the long braided middle like a river of corn at harvest. Those who gathered around said little. Even now, when such a thing is raised, silence seems the correct response. There is awe in good handiwork, and there is humility in finding what another age chose to trust to the ground. At the edge of the headland, wind flattens the grasses in long strokes. The tide pulls away from the mud and returns, pulls and returns, like breath in sleep. I imagine a leader standing here with the ring against the throat, looking east to the hazy line where unknown ships might appear. The ring is not armor. It is reminder. It says that the body wearing it serves a circle larger than itself. The households within a day's ride, the clients whose herds graze under old agreements, the strangers who must be fed before their business is heard. There were darker seasons. Rumor arrived of soldiers who wore red and iron, who kept count in tidy lines, who loved order more than the luck of a fair. In those years some rings were hurried into the soil with prayers that have not survived. Others were broken by their owners in a gesture that ended their obligation. A ring unmade cannot be demanded as a token of surrender. Even bent, the strands hold stubborn memory. Metal that has learned a pattern does not forget it easily. If you wish to understand such an object, lift your hand to your own throat and feel the hollow above the bones. Imagine there a circle that the eye can read from the far side of a field. Imagine its weight reminding you to measure words. Imagine the way light gathers in the small grooves and leaps again like a hare. Then imagine lowering it into a pit lined with clean turf, covering it with soil, and trusting the land to carry your intention forward. That is what a Torc at Snettisham can teach. That authority can be beautiful, and that beauty can be given away on purpose. Night comes quickly on the coast. The last color leaves the flats and the water keeps only the sky's pale memory. I draw a finger along the air where the ring once rested in its bed and follow the plate around to where the terminals swell. The circle closes as all true circles do. In the morning, we will walk away from Saltwind to a grove where words, not gold, carry the law, and we will listen to those who held a people's memory without ink. But for this hour, let the headland keep its secret brightness, and let the braided light lie quiet in the mind. Chapter 5 In the Grove of Judgment. What the learned kept by heart. Morning comes softly to the grove, as if even the light remembered to speak low. The path bends once, then twice, and the ditch on either side teaches the feet to mind themselves. Within the fence, the grass keeps a short, respectful nap, and the posts hold their weathered counsel. In this place, sharp things have no standing. Words carry the weight here, and memory is the strap that binds them. I have seen such gatherings when the dew was still on the sedges. Two households arrive by different tracks, eyes lowered, voices few. A third party comes last, the one whom both trust to make speech into settlement. In older days, before the new gods took root and the inked book sat at every elbow, this third was often a druid, a person bred to long patience, released from common levies, charged to remember. In later centuries, when monasteries hummed and the island laws were written by candlelight, the judge was called by another name, Brihin, and the work was much the same, to hold the map of custom in the head and point to the right road without drawing a sword. Training for such work was counted not in summers but in winters. Years upon years of verse and precedent, learned in the mouth until the tongue could say them in darkness without stumbling. Sacred matters were kept from the page. Doctrine was not to be trusted to letters. Yet notes for trade, tallies, and messages ran in straight capitals across clay and wood, and later, on the ocean-torn fringes of the West, small stones would wear sharp scores at their edges to mark a name. Memory bore the law's heart. Writing served its limbs. They called the worth of a person's standing the price of their face. One might measure insult by that value and set remedy accordingly. The face could be bruised in many ways, by word, by blow, by trespass, and the law taught how to mend each harm with goods, service, apology, or coin. Children were not merely born. They were often fostered, sent into another household so that affection and alliance braided together like a Torc strands. When a wrong came to the grove, the judge weighed not only the wound but also the web of bonds that any restitution would touch. There were no gouts of spectacle here, no ordeal by flame to satisfy a crowd's appetite for marvel. Persuasion and pledge did the work. If a debt was denied, the injured party might sit fasting at the wrongdoer's door, a silent pressure the law approved. If a promise needed strength, sureties were named, neighbors who would pay or stand for the debt if the promiser proved faithless. If a seizure had to be made, goods were gently lifted under rule, not grabbed under rage, and held until the question was resolved. The grove did not love force. It loved procedure. For injuries to the body, the law showed a curious tenderness. If a blow left a man lame, the striker owed not only a fine but sustenance during the healing. Meat, milk, a warm place to sleep, the service of hands when the hurt man's hands could not work. Should blindness come by another's fault, the price rose and the care lengthened, as if the law itself leaned down to guide the wounded along the path. Such maintenance did not erase the harm, but it bound the offender to the work of mending, and binding can teach more than punishment ever does. The judge's seating place was simple. A low platform of boards, a staff laid across the knees, a strap of plaited leather wound once around the hand to steady thought. The strap mattered. Words must not wander. A community's peace depends on the straightness of a sentence. When testimony strayed into boast or sorrow, the judge let the strap tighten and the breath slow, and memory would bring the matter back to its measure. Those waiting learned the rhythm. Claim, witness, reckoning, pledge, and then the accepted terms spoken aloud so that no one might later say, "I did not catch the word." Bards came near to this work, for poetry in those countries was more than ornament. Satire could sting a man's reputation as surely as a whip could welt his skin. Praise could lift a house for a generation. The learned men and women who kept genealogies also kept account of boundaries, rivers, fords, the rights of pasture and the shape of old bargains. When a quarrel touched land or blood, a poem might be recited that began at a great-grandfather's wedding and ended at the hedge in question. The verses were not merely pretty, they were documents set to meter. Across the water, in the wide lands where the curved art first learned to travel, the Druid's authority reached still further into public life. There, he stood between young men and the levee, declared holy days, and taught a philosophy that knitted soul to sky. He counted not only law but stars, and he told his pupils that speaking well mattered as much as thinking well. Yet even there, the rule remained: what was most sacred was carried by memory, because a living mouth can correct itself and the page cannot. In our grove on the island's edge, law kept company with custom that would outlast it. A pledge might be sealed by the passing of a drinking horn, a boundary affirmed by walking it with children so that their feet learned the turns. A marriage bargain was spoken by elders, but a young couple's shy glances completed it. When sorrow hung in the trees and the dead were carried by, the judge stood and set the staff aside, for grief is older than law and needs no ruling. I recall a case of cattle, the simplest and the most knotted of quarrels. One herd had strayed across a stream that shifted its course each winter. Calves were born on grass no one could swear belonged to one side or the other. Voices had risen in the lanes. Stones had been thrown, though none had struck. In the grove, the judge listened to the season in the story, heard the shape of the stream in the words, and asked that children be brought who had walked the banks at lambing time. Their small, careful testimony placed the calves' first steps under this alder and not that willow. The remedy was divided, 2 to the east, 2 to the west, and a promise to move the fence by a span of a man's outstretched arms when the water ran low. No one was pleased entirely. No one left empty-handed. Peace walked out between them like a third person. There were penalties for false speech, but the first medicine was shame, not scourge. A liar in the grove found his face price thinned. His neighbors calculated his word at a discount until good seasons refatted it. Those with silver tongues were watched as closely as those with quick hands. The judge's staff did not strike. It pointed. The strap did not bind. It reminded. When the new faith came ashore with its pages and its quiet insistence that law looks well in ink, the old wisdom did not vanish. Monks copied precepts that had lived long in the mouth, and glosses grew at the margins where one season's practice differed from another's. I have read such pages while the wind moved the skins on the scriptorium wall and thought how little the heart of it had changed. The poor were not to be crushed. The stranger was to be fed before the bargain was heard. Hospitality was a legal as well as a moral duty, and the learned, whatever title they bore, served not their own pride but the endurance of the village. If you would feel what the grove meant, close your eyes and listen for the ordinary sounds. A cow coughing beyond the hedge, a child's sleeve rasping against rough wool as she fidgets, a cart's wheel settling as the load shifts. The sacred is not absent from such noises. It hides inside them. The law of this land grew from that nearness. Field, river, hedge, and hearth, and those who kept it in their minds did not mistake eloquence for virtue. They measured fairness by whether a household could lift itself the next morning and go on. By afternoon, the sun has warmed the posts and the air above the ditch smells of crushed nettle. The judge speaks the last formula and taps the staff against the plank. Hands move then, relief creaks out of stiff backs, and the two households turn away along their separate tracks. In the wake of their departure, the grove feels larger, as if the words they left behind had made more room in the world. I sit for a while on the low platform and let the strap loosen. Memory is a weight, but it is a sweet one when borne for the sake of peace. Tomorrow we will step from shaded timber into the company of the bright ones who accept more than a single name, where a rider goddess shares her favor with stables and roads, and a quick-witted patron of trade answers to a name older than his Roman mask. For tonight, let the grove keep its hush, and let those who spoke here sleep under roofs that feel more their own. Chapter 6: Many names for the bright ones. Epona, Lugus, and the hill of Lugdunum. Roads teach the tongue to bend. Where two languages share a milestone, a traveler learns to say one god's name in more than one way and mean no disrespect by either. In these lands of curving metal and careful calendars, the bright ones did not hide. They moved openly along highways and rivers, answering to titles carried by traders, soldiers, and grooms. I have lingered by their small altars, where barley and coin lay together like old friends. First, the horse lady. In stables that smelled of sweat and hay, a little stone waited near the door. A woman seated sideways upon a mare, calm as a well, one hand on the animal's neck, the other on a basket of apples or a folded horn of plenty. Grooms touched the stone with fingers cracked by rope and winter, and horses bobbed their heads as if they recognized the figure's authority. She did not rule with terror. She kept cadence, foal to halter, halter to bit, cart to road, mount to battle, safe return to the stall. In towns where troop barracks stood, her name traveled farther than the local dialect, for cavalrymen are the same from coast to coast. They rode with her in mind and left her carved likeness wherever grain and water were kept. She was mistress of gates and padlocks, of farrier's nails and the soft oceans of a horse's eyes. If a column had to ford a river in spring flood, the officer who loved sense more than swagger poured a measure from his flask at her stone before ordering the first hooves down the bank. Beyond the stable wall, another bright one kept the crossroad. Traders knew him for a friend because he liked the cleverness of barter and the quickness of a good tongue. The folk of these countries had long given him their own name, a figure of skill and art, patron of makers, wits, and roads. When men who wore square helmets and carried wax tablets came pressing westward, they wrote his title in their own style and carved for him the signs they were used to: staff and purse, sometimes the rooster of dawn, sometimes the ram-horned snake that coils by profit and medicine both. No insult was intended. The locals nodded and said the foreign label aloud while keeping the older name in the mouth's quiet room. Bright is bright, whatever mask he wears. He had a hill for a city. Two rivers met beneath that height, a joining as grand as a marriage, and the crest held temples and offices like bees in honeycomb. Stone steps rose where once posts had marked sacred ground. On days of festival the hill looked dressed. Garlands, white smoke, soldiers' cloaks neat upon shoulders, merchants' fingers stained with ink, children craning to see the formalities. The city's very name kept faith with the older tongue, a memory of the bright one laid like a foundation under every tax and proclamation. In markets below, bronze weights kissed the scales and makers stamped their marks on good work. The hill kept an eye on it all, and across the river mouths of distant lands, ships carried the name outward as if it were a seal on every bale. The landscape itself joined the chorus. A road station took its title from a god's spring. A bridge kept the name of a guardian who watched the toll by day and the timbers by night. A high place answered to a sky lord remembered for thunder that shook the cattle into huddles. In the thicket of signs and posts, a traveler learned that this was not a country of single gods elbowing one another aside. It was a choir, voices entering and withdrawing as the season or the trade demanded. When foreign scribes wrote lists, 3 fierce names here, 3 kindly there, they did not always catch the loving confusion. A village knew better. It called whom it needed and often found the same face smiling through another title. In the North Country, a youth god kept his shine. Hunters and harpers favored him, and inscriptions cut by steady hands asked his help for sons who had not yet earned a beard, for songs that had not yet earned applause, for health to grow upright as a young ash. Elsewhere, dark stone bore 3 women carved shoulder to shoulder, their baskets full of fruit and bread. Those who learned to make a life from heather and field saw in the triple a truth. Plenty is more often the work of hands together than of a solitary hero. A traveler who prayed to one altar in summer might bind a ribbon to another in winter and think himself faithless to neither. Coins carried the story in small. On one face, a rule's head or a likeness required by the new authority. On the other, the native shorthand of hoof and wheel, boar and horse, spirals curling like breath on a chill morning. The bright one of wit kept his favor with die-cutters and traders alike, and the horse lady watched from her stable shrines as small silver circles poured through calloused hands to pay for oats and vaulting repairs. The gods did not scorn such traffic. They thrived in it. I remember a wayside altar no higher than a man's knee, set where the ridge path drops into the beach. Its stone was not white and proud. It was the color of rain. A carved dedication ran along the ledge in clear letters, and someone had crowned the block with a little wreath of ivy that would wither by evening. A muleteer paused, touched the stone with the back of 2 fingers, and said his thanks without a flourish, for a wheel that had not shattered, for a rope that had not given, for a slope that had held under hoof. He was a man of few words and dirty hands, and he had no patience for the curving flattery of poets. Yet the altar had his measure. It asked nothing finer than gratitude. In towns where officials liked their paperwork thick, bilingual stones multiplied. 1 line in the foreign tongue, 1 line in the local, the meaning braided like the strands of a torc. A stranger arriving from the south could read the formal name and feel at home. A woman whose grandmother had spoken no Latin could follow the older word and feel seen. Between the 2 scripts ran goodwill, sometimes uneasy, sometimes easy as a cart on smooth flagging. Not every story told of harmony. In storm years the Thunderlord's followers grew bold, and men with scarred arms spoke of oaks split and wheels burned black. In years when a census pressed too close, the quick god of speech had to listen to petitions not for profit but for protection. Hide my boy until the levy passes. Give my debt a tongue that can persuade the collector to patience. The horse lady heard different prayers in winter than in summer. More for fodder and shelter when sleet rattled against stable doors. More for temper and pacing when the fairs opened and riders grew reckless on green horses. Yet even in heavy times the shrines filled. People who work earth and iron do not give up their friends lightly, mortal or divine. On the hill of the 2 rivers, the bright one's festival cut through the year like a path worn smooth by 1,000 feet. It was a market day and a holy day together. Lawyers' cloaks brushed traders' caps, and wheelwrights bargained within earshot of philosophers declaiming under porticos. A veteran put his hand on a pillar and asked for a son's safe birth in a village a week's travel away. A woman from the salt flats offered a twist of amber for protection on the road back to her briny pans. If a foreign traveler stood there and asked the hill whose city it was, the hill would have answered, "It belongs to our God of many names, to the rivers joining, and to the agreements made in his sight." Sometimes the generosity of naming ran the other way. A people took the foreign master's favorite god and whispered to one another, "That is our bright one in different clothing. We can speak with him through this mask." In this way, shrines multiplied rather than vanished. A new figure was not a replacement but a doorway. Old prayers walked through and came out the other side carrying a different emblem, the core unchanged. Those who see only conquest in such meetings miss the craft in them. A living faith mends without leaving a seam. When the light thins and the road empties, the shrines keep their posts. A mouse prints a line of delicate commas across the dust of an altar step. The horse stamps once in her stall and goes on dreaming. A merchant counts his small change by feel, murmuring the bright one's name under his breath as if it were an abacus's click. I pass with the evening and think how soft the borders are between titles when need is honest. Tomorrow we will walk away from public stone towards song set down at last on creamy pages, where boy heroes hold fords and queens of sovereignty test the worth of kings. The tales were written later, in different houses and for different comforts, yet they carry the weather of these older gods, the horse's breath on a cold dawn, the quick smile of a lord of roads, the city that holds a hill like a bright thought. For now, may the many names keep the traveler safe, whatever language the lips can manage at day's end. Chapter 7 Song on Parchment. The Ulster Deeds and the Welsh Branches. Night gathers around the scriptorium like a hood, and the lamps make small suns upon the desks. I have watched monks sharpen quills to a hush finer than snow. I have watched vellum stretched until it remembered the plain, and I have heard, folded among psalms and genealogies, the old breath of warriors and queens making room for themselves in the margin. It is here that the wind-carried tales of the West let themselves be tied to pages, not to be caged, but to be kept through winters that would have buried them. On an island where the sea is the common road, a calfskin bears the name of a cow the color of stormlight. Another gathering of leaves remembers a king's court where poets loved a difficult line. In these books, written by long robes and quiet hands, the fords of the north shine again. A boy, no taller than his shadow, goes down to meet an army and finds in himself more than a man's measure. They call him by a name the mouth must learn to lift carefully, a name that tastes of hound and harbor, vow and edge. He trains under a woman across the water, on a coast where basalt keeps secrets and ospreys count the shoals. She gifts him a spear that flies like a thought and wounds like a riddle answered too late. The land he defends is a ridge-crowned country where a royal hall sits above fields stitched with hedges. The hall keeps its fame in wooden rings that have long since melted back into earth. Yet the hill remembers the patterns of its posts, and so do the stories. The queen who rides against him is as certain as weather. She measures worth by cattle and calculation, counts her fortunes in red hides and pledged champions, and speaks in a voice that makes men look to their boots. Beside her, a king who weighs love against pride and finds both heavier than he can carry. The quarrel that moves them both is dressed as a raid, but beneath the harness lies a question about honor, sovereignty, and what it means to be enough. In these pages, oaths do not float. They have the mass of Gisa, the bindings that tell a hero the edges of his life. Break them and the world breaks you. Keep them and the world asks for a price anyway. The boy at the ford learns this law early. He stands until the river itself seems to take his side and divide around him. When the fighting shows him its worst face, his body answers with a storm that frightens even his friends, a change of sinew and gaze that makes the air bruise. Afterward, when quiet returns, he sits with his back to a stone and eats like one who has forgotten how to be hungry. The tale does not apologize for him. It simply sets him there and lets the reader decide whether to love him or to fear the shape of such necessity. Women in these stories are more than shores upon which ships make landfall. A prophetess goes before an army with her dark birds. A goddess of sovereignty appears first as a woman who will not be hurried, testing whether a king can be patient enough to rule the land as he rules a household. A foster mother carries a sleeping bundle whose cry will later shake a province awake. The queen who fields an army is not only appetite. She is a steward of order, as relentless in her way as winter, her charioteer counting the measure of ground each day like beads. The boy's teacher across the sea gives him not gentleness but form, a lattice of movements so strict that his fury can find a doorway rather than burn the house. The monks who set these deeds in a hand steady enough to outlive moth and damp were not blind to the edges. They frame the tales with blessings, and sometimes their margins scold, as if to say, "This is a memory from an older house. Keep it, but do not take its fires into your bed." Yet the ink betrays affection. It lingers over the names of horses and weapons, over the nicknames of fools and champions, over the laughter in feast halls when wordplay cuts closer than blades. The page allows in what the mouth would have remembered anyway, the shape of a spear but, the way a chariot's axle hums, the taste of spring water when a warrior's lip is split. Across the eastern sea, in a land of deep valleys and coastal winds, for long branches grow from one trunk of story. A prince exchanges places with a lord of the underworld and learns how a king behaves in a country where silence is the true coin. A woman with the patience of starlight rides a horse that will not be hurried, her son's name passing from tale to tale like a candle flame handed from palm to palm. A giant whose head will not consent to die becomes a bridge between life and death, and his sister's sorrow labors like tide inside a shell until it sings itself into ruin. A magician weaves flowers into a wife and is answered by a woman who refuses to be only what was made of her. A boy with a hand like certainty earns a name that fits him as a hauberk fits a hero, and loses it for a time when envy teaches by ambush. Here 2 horses stamp and breathe. Here 2 cauldrons promise too much and take their payment in hard coin. Harps are not ornaments but instruments that steer a king's temper as surely as reins guide a mare's neck. The little unfamous people of every village, smiths, midwives, porters, gatekeepers who need to be charmed or scolded, are drawn with the same ink as queens and enchanters. And always there is the land. The sand that holds delicate hoof marks for a tide. The birch with its clean bark that monks will shave and use as scraps for reminders. The hills which lift a hero higher than his right and then remind him how far he can fall. I have seen the 2 great books gathered in a single room, one dark as a hawk's back, the other pale as milk with a shadow inside it. Their scribes copied not only the 4 branches, but court's business, saints' journeys, and poems that need grief until it rises into song. When a reader moves between the branches, the seasons change, and the gods wear mortal clothes that cannot quite hide their shape. These are not foreign divinities stuffed into local garb. They are family members who have learned to keep the feast on a different date, men and women whose small, precise habits, fiddle with the ring, tug the sleeve, glance beneath the lash, betray power that a later age will call by humbler names. In both islands, the old weather is present even when the text keeps its eyes on kings. Heads speak after death and give counsel that ought to be followed. Bridges are not only timber, they are bodies laid down for others to cross. Swine eat the grain of the otherworld and are no longer quite ordinary. Birds arrive with human voices and sit upon shoulders as if they were messengers and not mere animals. None of this is shouted. It is told in the same tone one would use to list a dowry or recite a boundary. The marvelous is woven to the practical until the cloth will not allow separation. And what of time? The scribes keep it as they keep prayers, measured, obedient. But the tales themselves slide through centuries the way a river passes a stone, touching, rounding, sometimes flooding, sometimes barely wetting the surface. A hand that has just copied a gospel will turn the leaf and set down the names of men who fight naked to the waist with hair like dark banners. A monk who knows the feast days by heart will write of fire leaping between a woman's knees and call it law, not magic. The page makes peace between worlds that argued before. It is a field where winter wheat and summer barley somehow stand side by side. At the edges, archaeology and story lean toward one another as neighbors over a hedge. A fort described as a ring of timber and earth lies exactly where the tale says it stood. A gold pin in a pattern the storytellers favored turns up in Peat far from the court that loved such designs. A name carved on a stone beside a river mouths a sound that the tale preserves, though the spelling has learned new tricks. Neither proves the other. Both take comfort from the meeting. If you listen closely you will hear the small machinery of transmission. The fosterage that knits houses together and keeps a boy safe in another's hall. The way a poet purchases hospitality with a quick stanza that praises the beef without flattering the host too much. The reciter's hand, 2 fingers upon the temple as if to steady the room while a difficult set of lines is coaxed out of hiding. When the stories were finally taken into the monastery's winter, they did not stiffen. They learned to enjoy the page's warmth. And the monks, who had thought themselves only guardians, realized that they were also kin, because they too loved order, and a tale that fits itself to the length of a leaf and ends with a flourish of red is a kind of liturgy. I have stood at a ford where the boy hero once was said to have held the river, and the water said nothing. It merely went about its business, ruffling a reed, taking the sky into itself, releasing it again farther on. But when a girl and her grandmother came to toss bread crusts to a greedy duck, the old woman told the child a smaller, homelier version of that great stand. Boldness, caution, the right day to cross, the wrong day to boast. That is how epics live when the vellum cracks. They settle into sayings, into the way a person ties a knot or chooses to be silent when an unkind truth would win only a hollow victory. Toward evening, the scribes lay their quills in shells and clamp their books closed with thongs. The room smells of resin and wool, of lamp smoke and the faint iron of scraped hide. Outside, The lane that leads to the river is muddy with hooves and cartwheels. The heroic age is not gone. It is sleeping within the paper walls of these little houses, waiting for a mouth to open and let it out. Tomorrow we will turn back to the year's 4 gates and listen for the footfalls of feast days on the village green. Thresholds where the tales often began and where, if the world is kind, they will keep beginning as long as fires are lit at dusk. Chapter 8: The 4 Gates of the Year. Samhain, Imbolc, Beltane, Lughnasad. The year does not turn like a wheel with spokes of equal weight. It opens by gates that stand in different weather, and no traveler passes them without feeling the latch lift in the bones. In the west of these islands and along the old roads of the mainland, for thresholds taught the tongue how to name time. A dark gate where the year began, a milk-bright gate where cold softened, a fire gate where cattle and people renewed their courage, and a harvest gate where hills rang with games and vows. I have walked each one, listening for the work behind the rite, herds and rents, bargains and law, the careful tendings that make a village endure. Samhain, the dark gate. The cattle come down from the high grazing. Hooves drum the lanes, and the last gnats lift in the low sun as if undecided about living. Hearths are swept, not for guests only, but because counting requires clean places. Stock tallied, dues gathered, promises renewed. The year begins in darkness here, as if wisdom prefers to start with a listening pause. In the old reckoning of months, the light half has given way to the dark. The round rests on its night side. On hilltops of power, kingship was once measured against this threshold. In the royal precinct where earthen rings step like ripples, assemblies took their place in the season when harvest was safe and travel still possible. Hospitality was not ornament but law. Those who came under a roof were fed before their errands were heard. In such evenings the hall shone like a ship, and the people exchanged news and marriage plans while the steward's staff sounded lightly against the boards to keep order. Between farm and fort, smaller rites worked toward the same end. Doors were left ajar for a little while, candles set in windows not to invite mischief, but to demonstrate that the living remembered their dead and kept their manners in mind. Masks, when they came, were not mere sport. A face hidden by a hood or a soot-blackened cheek declared what everyone already knew, that the boundary between this world and the next was thin tonight, and that jest, like a small bridge, could carry a person across a frightening stream. Men and women who seldom sang then, and those who could make a rhyme traded their craft for cake and a blessing against winter's long appetite. In the northwestern plains where a queen's palace once kept its ring, a cave mouths the dark. Farmers pointed to it for generations and said, "That place speaks at the turning of the year." Whether the tale grew from sound, wind, fox, water, or from the honest terror that an opening in the earth inspires, the lesson was one. The world has incited a door, and Samhain is when the key turns. Wise folk kept a coal from the old fire to start the new, for continuity is a kind of courage. Imbolc, the milk-bright gate. Snow thins along the hedges. Use heavy with promise stamp and turn, and then lamplight hears the new bleat that makes even hard men smile as if they had been forgiven some unspoken fault. The season's name tastes of milk on the tongue, a reminder that in these countries wealth once walked on 4 legs and spoke in low voices. Kitchens lay clean linen on tables and set out a bowl and a crust as if expecting a guest from the old order of things, a woman of light and craft who loved hearths and wells, and who would later be honored under a newer name without losing her old work. Girls plait straw into small, star-armed crosses and hang them where smoke will touch them lightly. Mothers lay out a little cloth on a sill and say, "Let it catch the night's blessing. We will keep it for fever and for fear." Wells receive ribbons, not because water is vain, but because gratitude needs an object. Farriers' shops grow busy again, not with war but with the ordinary decencies of hoof and nail. In byres the first milk steams in pails, and cows turn wide eyes toward the door where a child peeks in to see what the year has decided. The learned kept a calendar, the village kept a sense. Both agreed that this gate is inward, domestic, and practical. It blesses craft, spindle, needle, smith's tongs, the page laid smooth for a careful hand. A woman kneels to kindle the day's first fire and says the old words that keep flame and household in agreement. A boy takes a pail to the frost-silvered yard, and his breath walks ahead of him like a little spirit. The world is not yet warm, but it has quit despair. Beltane, the fire gate. Morning comes green enough to drink. On a hill at the island's navel, folk have long told how twin fires were kindled, and how messengers carried their flame outward so that other hills might answer. Whether every hill truly burned is not the point. What mattered was that people believed summer had a proper door, and that it should be opened with ceremony. Cattle move again, this time up toward the grass that tastes of sky. They pass between fires set at a cautious distance, their hides brushed with smoke the way a child's hair is smoothed before company. The rite is not cruelty. It is courtesies paid to hazard. Winter has left lice and worry in the herds. Smoke chases both as far as it can. Men cut switches of rowan and tie small red threads to them, a hedge against whatever looks hungrily at living things. Milk pails and churns are marked with ash so that butter will come and not sulk in the churn as if it were above its station. At the broom-bright edge of the village, couples step away from chaperones and the management of elders. Words are easier now that the fields have been turned and the oxen's shoulders have remembered their work. Some pairings are spoken aloud to parents. Some are sealed by glances and will be reckoned with later at harvest. Up on the rougher ground, summer sheilings wake. The little houses of turf and stone where young people will keep cattle while grass rises. Songs from those huts return to the valley like swallows. May boughs appear on doors, hawthorn if the season is brave, birch if folk are cautious about inviting the fae too close. The first washing in the river belongs to those who rise early and know where the bank holds. They come home with cheeks bitten red by cold and eyes that are pleased with themselves. Market opens wide. Tinkers mend kettles at a pace that sounds like laughter. The smith lifts his hammer with the certain wrist of a man who has put winter behind him. Lughnasad, the harvest gate. Heat leans on the fields until barley heads nod as if drowsy. Blackberries test their purple. Bilberries spot the hills with blue. On broad meadows beside old earthworks, poles rise, booths unfold, and a fair begins that is older than any single town. The gate is named for a bright one whose wit carried him across countries. The games he loved are played in his honor, and the memory of a foster mother, resting under a green mound, receives as much respect as the god himself. People bring more than coin. They bring disputes ready for settlement, contracts ready for witness, marriages ready to be declared in front of a crowd generous enough to applaud. Hand in hand clasp and let go again. A year's trial promised and a year's parting promised if peace cannot be kept. Practical romance designed to spare households the ruin of stubbornness. Poets win cows for lines that make hard men forget to scowl. Wrestlers throw one another on grass still damp from dawn. A harp string breaks and is tied again with such quiet skill that the music does not falter. Hills that matter to kingship become public rooms at this gate. On one, a mound that keeps a woman's name hosts races and solemnities. Elsewhere, other hills with their own old gravities lend dignity to bargains. Traders tally in good chalk on dark boards. Judges, who in winter spoke beneath trees, now sit on benches where dust rises and moths pursue the shade of awnings. Children taste freedom that tastes surprisingly of bilberries. The purple tongues and lips that result are not marks of sin but of belonging. Harvest itself is not yet in, but its success can be guessed. A handful of ears rubbed in the hands will tell a farmer what to expect from the first sheaf. If rain holds off, horses will step out with carts before long. If rain comes early, the fair will close with brisk handshakes and the hope of better weather declared like a charm. The gate blesses vigor, not finish. Says, begin to gather, begin to bargain, begin to declare your alliances. The reaping will justify you. The round and its uses. These 4 thresholds did more than decorate the year. They choreographed it. Rents and hostings, fosterings and fairs. Each found its proper week because the gates stood where they stood. Firewood was not begged for in spring because it had been prudently stacked at Samhain. Midwives' hands did not tremble in late winter because they had been busy and honored at Imbolc. Herds did not wander unprotected onto tick-rich hills because Beltane smoke had been walked between their flanks and small red threads tied where glance and hoof are vulnerable. Marriages did not wither for lack of witness because Lughnasad gave them a stage and a safety rope. Names shifted as tongues did, and later faiths blessed the same doors with their own words. The milk-bright lady found her way into a church and came out with a veil. The god of craft and roads learned to share an altar without losing his quick smile. Hilltop fires were no longer kindled on every slope, but kitchens kept their own spark alive through long winters as if they remembered the larger beacon. In all of this, the practical was never far from the sacred. A people who live close to weather cannot afford a religion that makes no sense in the field. I keep in my ledger a dozen small scenes from these gates. A mother burns the ends of rowan twigs and smudges a sleepy cow's forehead, then kisses the same place with a tenderness that needs no doctrine. A boy puts his hand into a sack at fair and feels the fine scales of a salmon he cannot afford. The fishmonger sees the hunger and slides the boy a small strip to taste, a prosperity spell disguised as charity. At the dark gate, a widower sits with a cup between both palms and speaks aloud the name of the woman who used to take the first sip. He leaves the door unlatched for a time, then closes it gently, as if settling a blanket. When a calendar is hammered from bronze or a law is spoken with strap tight around the judge's hand, those are public proofs. These gates are the private ones, kept by every household with a hearth and a field. They require no army to enforce them. They arrive the way a familiar road arrives underfoot, felt before it is seen, trusted before it is measured. Tomorrow we will leave the sunlit green for the low brown of peat and the long patience of bog water, where kingship and ritual sink together and are kept like a sealed letter for a later age to read. For now, stand with me at the harvest gate and feel the meadow's nap under your soles, the weight of a small basket on your arm, the hum of argument from the judges' benches, the laughter blown thin by heat. The year is opening its last bright door before it enters the deep rooms again. Step through and carry sweetness in your mouth for the road ahead. Chapter 9, The King and the Bog. What the peat remembers. The bog keeps a kinder silence than the sea. It does not crush. It embraces. It draws into itself whatever the living bring. Milk sealed in bark, a churn of butter for a lean year, a wooden idol with a cautious smile, a shoe, a bead, and then, by the slow breath of moss and water, it keeps what it has been given. I have walked that dusky skin in every season, hearing the small sigh of peat beneath my feet, and I have learned that the bog's memory is exact. It does not invent, preserves. In the lands where hilltop rings once opened for law and feast, the low grounds kept their own message. Men and women laid into the moss did not lie as bones do under dry fields. Tannin and time worked a soft miracle. Skin darkened, hair held its waves, a hand kept its nail, a furrow of brow outlived a century of kings. When the spade or the cutter's blade brought such faces back, the living stepped closer and lowered their voices. The dead looked as if sleep had paused, not ended. Among those who returned were people of consequence. One man from the Midlands rose with hands broad as paddles and nails tended as if he had not known the meanest work. The food he carried in him told of status, the meat and dairy that mark a household where visitors are many and storehouses seldom empty. Marks on his body spoke not of accident but of ceremony turned stern, of bonds broken, of a chest touched in a manner too deliberate to be chance. I will not itemize sorrows. The peat has already done that, and kindly. Let it be enough to say that his fate was careful, not careless, and that care itself is a kind of testimony. Another's hair, still stiff with something fragrant, rose in a tuft as jaunty as a youth on fair day. The scent traveled from far shores, resin once traded along long roads of tin and wine, worked into a style surely prepared for public eyes. He was not dressed for hiding. He was dressed for being seen. Yet the bog asked him to rest, and he did, and his small face returned with a look that made the living uncertain whether to mourn a stranger or a cousin from a very old branch. To the east, across seas that carry ships as easily as clouds carry weather, a man returned with a woven loop still close to his neck and a face composed as any sleeper's. He, too, had been given to a wet country that knows how to keep secrets. When I think of him, I remember how the bog's acids gently preserved beard stubble and the soft line of a closed mouth, as if to remind the world that even mortality has its daylight, tender, precise, unwilling to insult the dead with haste. Why were such people given to the moss? The living have argued this since they first saw 100 hand that looked ready to move. Some say kingship carries taboos like a crown, and that when a taboo is broken the land itself must be fed, not with revenge, but with a ritual return of its guardian. Others speak of a triple price: breath stopped, blood let, water received, a balancing of elements to reset a clock that had begun to strike wrong. Still others remember the old bargain between rule and plenty. When corn fails, when cattle sicken, when borders fray, a king is not only honored, he is answerable. If he cannot wed the land to prosperity, the land will unwed him. In these countries, kingship was not merely a man on a seat. It was a marriage to soil, a contract with rivers. A ruler's body was a public thing. Men lowered their heads to his breast in token of their obedience. He, in turn, kept his person as a house keeps its hearth. No stain left untended, no care ignored. Marks upon some of the Bogdead speak in that language. A chest altered so that no one might make the old gesture of fealty upon it again. A hand that once bore a ring which the moss did not trouble to keep. A belt that reads like a sentence. The details are mournful. The meaning is steady. Rule is a promise with penalties. Yet the bog's gifts are not all stern. To the west of the royal plains, I have watched a jar of butter rise, pale as moonfat, from a cut bank where a man's father had hidden it against hunger. Wrapped in bark, lidded with wood, it had lain in the cool peat for a length of time that makes our household care feel brief. Its smell, when the lid was eased, carried the past into the room like a refrain. Elsewhere, a little human figure carved from a single trunk, its eyes mere scoops and its mouth a thoughtful line, came up with the wet that darkens everything into dignity. Those who lifted it did not laugh. They set it upright as if it had been waiting to be taken into a new century's keeping. The bog keeps roads as well. Across a great flat where reeds whisper for miles, oak planks once made a straight way, laid shoulder to shoulder by crews who measured their year by the building of that causeway. It ran like a sentence from settled ground toward a far landmark, through land that could swallow a man in 3 steps. Carts crossed there, and women with baskets, and men with horned cattle who did not wish to walk the long way around. Some say such a road was for tribute, some for ceremony, some for the plain convenience that breeds piety without a priest's help. I remember the cut faces of the planks and the pegs that knit them, and I think of a community lifting 1,000 trees and agreeing to a single purpose for one long season. Bogs sit where boundaries blur. Neither forest nor lake, neither field nor river. The people of curving metalwork and careful calendars loved such edges. They understood that certain bargains go best at thresholds. Fords, gates, doorways, the lip of a mound, the skin of a bog. To give a body back to waterlogged earth is to speak the language of in-between places. It says, "This life touched many worlds, household and hall, field and law, kin and client. And now the land that underwrote those worlds must be consulted directly." When the moss yielded a tall man's arm once, the skin held a cross-hatched band as if a plaited cord had been worn there for long. Near the upper arm, a fine plate had left its pattern deep, muscle grown around memory. I have seen such cords on living men, marks of oath or office, sometimes ornaments, sometimes chains they chose to wear. Whether this man's tether was politic or pious, the Peat remembered the plate better than the words that explained it. That is the way of all good archives. They keep the object plainly and leave the interpretation to those who visit. The gentleness of preservation can trick us into gentleness about the stories themselves. We should not mistake grace for softness. The bog is a careful clerk, not a sentimental one. It shows us the rough linen coat, the last meal's grains, the hair laid with imported resin, the tightened loop, the blemishes of a life lived in public, and asks us to think about the cost of order in a world where winter is long and oaths are the only reliable fence. A ruler who breaks faith with the land breaks faith with every table below his hall. The remedy for that does not come from a single angry household. Comes from the ground. I keep also the memory of everyday crossings. The wooden sled that hauled peat bricks to a farm where smoke needed feeding. The children who ran along a turf bank with kites cut from old cloth. The woman who left a small pot of first milk tucked in a niche of roots. feeling for the quiet smile of a goddess who cares for wells and hearths. Sacrifice is a large word. Offering is the older one. The bog understands both. You may ask, were these folk who returned to us from the moss victims or kings, strangers or honored debtors? The honest answer is that the bog does not say. It records without gossip. Yet the pattern of signs, status in one, adornment in another, method repeated with ritual stubbornness, leans toward a story we recognize from laws and tales, the health of the land being treated as a person, requiring keeping, sometimes requiring price. In a country where the ruler's body is the first public building, such prices are terrible, but they are not random. Softly, then, the peat is a book and it is patient. Keeps butter for a lean year and it keeps the shape of a face for a lesson about power. It holds the road that let a king's messengers pass and the small carved friend who stood by a hearth as a household's private altar. It receives coin and cauldron, shoe and bead, and from time to time it gives them back, asking us to remember that wealth is a trust, that law has teeth even when spoken gently, and that the edge between worlds is strong enough to bear the careful weight of our dead. Evening comes early on the moor. Curlews stitch the air with their cries. The cuttings fill slowly with shadow, and the pools reflect a sky the color of iron cooled in water. I stand where an old plank road once ran and feel under the saws the certainty of timber long since lifted. Tomorrow we will go to the bend of a great river, to a grass mound whose bones are stone and whose heart is a passage. There, at midwinter, the sun walks a corridor and wakes a room older than any tale we have told tonight. For now, let the bog hold its peace, and let those it keeps teach us the heavy, useful kindness of remembering. Chapter 10, Sun in the Old Stone. Winter light at Bóinne. The river makes a slow bend here, like an arm that has learned to cradle. On the inside of that bend rise green mounds whose bones are stone and whose skins are grass. The oldest houses I know that still receive a guest without a word. Long before iron found a place at the hearth, long before curved metal learned to speak in spirals upon brooch and shield, farming folk of the polished stone age lifted slabs and set them in thoughtful order, then heaped the earth over their work until the hills themselves became rooms. At the largest of these mounds a pale face once greeted the sun, a frontage of white stone gathered from far places, set so that morning would strike it and the whole earthwork would gleam like frost at noon. Around the base lie great curbstones, each one shouldered into position and many carved with spirals, chevrons, lozenges, and river curves. At the entrance a single stone keeps a famous sign. 3 great spirals that turn toward one another until they seem to be listening. The stone is not fierce, concentrates. Beyond it runs a narrow passage, long enough to cool the breath and steady the step. Its roof is not flat but corbelled, each ring of stone leaning inward to the next until a single capstone closes the sky. Water has tried for long ages to find a way through and has been refused. The chamber is as dry as a pocket hidden in a winter coat. In its recesses once lay ash and bone, careful leavings from burnings elsewhere, and low basin stones that still remember the weight of offerings placed with the patience of a people who knew how to wait. High above the doorway is a small opening, no larger than a shepherd might cut to watch his flock without stepping outside. That little square, framed in stone, is the roof box, and it keeps a secret that is not a secret at all. On the shortest mornings of the year, when the fields are rimed and the cattle stand with breath like white fleece, a blade of sunlight slips through that aperture, drops to the passage floor, and begins to walk inland. It moves like a measured thought, not hurrying, not idling, touching first the threshold, then the long stone flags, then the lip of the chamber itself. For a while, the space of a short prayer, the length of a winter's tale, the far wall glows as if a hearth had been lit within the hill. Then the light withdraws in proper order and leaves the stones to their long patience again. It is an old conversation between sun and house, older than the tongues that later added their poetry to this valley. Those who built it were not dabblers. The passage lies true to its work. The corbelled vault keeps out the bad season. The roof box frames the dawn's narrow blade with such exactness that a single cart width either way would have ruined the trick. A people who set such things in place did not need a book to teach them time. They had the nearby barley's ear, the river's gossip, and this yearly visit to remind them that, even at the depth of dark, return is part of the bargain. Across the bend stand other mounds with other tempers. One keeps two passages that face the waking and the dying of the day, its curbstones scored with more carvings than any place of its kind. Another sits a little apart, its name remembered as Darkness, as if the low sun that attends it in winter taught someone long ago to speak softly in its presence. The whole plain is stitched with lesser mounds, pits, banks, and the faint paths of long-vanished timber circles and processional ways. What looks like pasture has been a gallery for as long as memory can stand, and the galleries know how to hold silence without losing meaning. Later centuries laid other stories across these hills as carefully as a blanket over a sleeping child. Poets called the great mound a palace, the dwelling of a young lord whose lovers and riddles kept the courts awake. They gave the river a goddess's name and told how her curiosity birthed a current that would not stop. I do not scold them for doing so. The place invites gentleness of speech. When farmers mended hedges within sight of the white face, when ferrymen learned the river's moods by watching a single standing wave, when children rolled down the green flanks and laughed until their ribs ached, the old mound did not trouble itself about titles. It held its room for the light and let the living borrow the rest. There are marks here of later hands as well. Pits dug to make sense of the old work, gaps where stones were levered out for mills, scratches where modern tools asked their questions too closely. Even so, the design remains. Stand in the doorway and look toward the heart, and you will feel the house teaching you to narrow your attention until you arrive, calm and ready, at the place the sun will use. Place a palm on a carved spiral, and you will find the groove shallow where fingers often run and deeper where the eye prefers to travel alone. Such wear is a kind of gloss, the commentary of love. I have counted seasons by this valley's breath. In the bright half of the year the barley lifts its green to meet the sky, and the river goes about its low summer business. Otter, eel, kingfisher like a blue thought along the bank. In the dark half, frost writes the grass in silver, and the roofs speak in their small winter language, tick and creak. Yet the houses in the hills keep the same temperature of patience in both weathers. They are neither eager nor sullen. They are certain. The people who raised them carried stone on backs and sledges, floated burdens on the river's shoulder, and learned the trick of leverage with poles, ropes, and many hands. No one builds such a place for a year. One builds for grandchildren one will never see, and for a sunbeam that will visit others long after one's own breath has thinned into the common air. If you wish to borrow the lesson these mounds keep, come at the hinge of winter and wait in the shadowed passage, even if the sky is sullen and the sun will not be persuaded. Sit with the cold seeping into your boots and the smell of stone in your lungs. Think of the people who knelt here long before iron, who learned how to grind grain with stones until it answered yes, who gave the careful remains of their dead to this cool room and trusted the year to turn. When the light does come, if not today, then on the next short morning, it will not surprise you. It will feel like a word you have known since childhood but only now understand entire. Around the bend of the river the curving art of later ages, the bronze calendars, the boundary shrines and river gifts, the torcs and the groves and the bright ones with many names, all these will have their day, and their days will pass. This house of stone answers to a longer rhythm. It is not a temple to conquest or a monument to singular glory. It is a machine for hope, set to the measure of the sun, maintained by patience, and repaired by awe. The light fades. The river bears a cold reflection and keeps moving. The great grass mound leans back into dusk until only the entrance stone shows, its triple spiral cradling shadow instead of gold. I step away, careful of the slick earth, and follow the bend until the house of winter lies behind me and the noise of ordinary life returns. Sheep calling, a cart complaining, someone laughing at a small error that will be a remembered story by spring. Chapter 11, The Edge of Words. Ogham stones and the memory of names. Wind likes an upright stone. It combs the lichen one way and then back. It sets a low music in the grass, and it teaches the palm to find the groove where letters hide in plain sight. On headlands and in pasture corners, along churchyards that arrived later, by lanes that tilt toward the sea, stand the long pillars with their secrets cut not on the face, but on the edge. This is the script that keeps to the margin, the writing that chooses a spine. Ogham. A mason set the stem of the stone upright and turned its arras, the sharp meeting of two faces, into a path for the knife. Strokes gather there in small families, 1 to 5, each family slanting its own way across the edge. A single stroke bites from right to left, its twin answers from the other side. Some run like a small ladder across the arras itself. The vowels take their turn as short ticks and points, shy and precise. The message travels not across, but along, beginning low at the base and climbing toward the top, as if a name wished to rise into weather before it could be read entire. Most of these stones do not preach. They introduce. The name of, says the first cluster, and then, with a dignity that does not need ornament, son of, and often of the people of, the tribe resting as a final chord. Here and there a blessing or a plea for memory, but chiefly they are witnesses. A person stood in this land, was kin to this person, belonged to this folk. What a court records in many pages, the stone says in the width of a palm. Tools were simple and serious. Iron chisels, hammers with smooth tempers, a line snapped in red to keep the script true as it climbed. A mason's apprentice learned to feel the edge more than see it, because the weather or his own shadow could trick the eye. He ran his thumb along the arras and let the skin tell him whether the notches kept their distance cleanly. When the work finished, the cutting showed pale against the darker stone, and the letters looked like frost that does not melt even in summer. These pillars grew first where the sea writes its own script on cliffs and where fields run down to hard coasts. They kept company with older mounds and newer crosses without quarrel. In some places, the later faith added a small cross to the face and let the edge keep its older business. In others, Latin walked beside the native score, the two tongues tied like a double plate around one memory. More than once a stone that had marked a burial was walked to a boundary and made a witness there. The same name now saying, "This is as far as your cattle should graze, and no farther by agreement." The names themselves travel like weather, some shaped by the shore, some by mountains, some by old gods become gentler in the mouth. You can hear fosterage in them, you can hear alliance, you can hear a hope that a house will carry its pride honestly. When a traveler learns to read the strokes with a fingertip, he can listen to the dead without intruding. A few clusters of lines, and a person stands up briefly in the mind. His father's name follows him like a shadow, his people's name like a road. Not all were set in stone at first. Wood remembers the same edges, and a scribe who keeps a tally stick knows how useful a staff can be when a message must be hidden from casual eyes. But wood burns or rots, and bark does not like long winters. Stone keeps what it is told. In bogland and on granite, in sandstone cut as true as butter will allow, the strokes keep their small republics of meaning and ask nothing but a hand to trace them now and then so the grooves will not be mistaken for cracks. I have watched a child learn the families of strokes by counting them in a sing-song. 1 on this side, 2 on that, 3 across the edge, for steep, 5 like the claws of a wren. She does not know the grammar yet. She knows only that the world wrote itself here, and that her finger can read it. That is enough for a beginning. In time she will come to the habit these stones have kept. To start at the root, to name one's father without shame, to belong to a people and not pretend to be self-invented. The edge teaches humility without saying the word. Some stones lean now, some lie, some serve as gateposts for fields whose owners have forgotten what the notches once promised. Yet when rain darkens the faces, the letters light up, and even an untrained eye feels that the edge is busy with intention. If you stand with your back to the wind and read upward, the names parcel out the land as gently as a lullaby. This person, of this father, of this people, held and was held here. The lesson is neither loud nor small. It is steady. Tomorrow we will leave the whisper of edges for a different kind of voice. The long bronze throats that called assemblies and answered valleys. The beast-headed trumpets that once stood taller than men, and the low, round horns whose breath runs like honey in winter air. The land had music as well as ink, and both learned to travel farther than the shout of a single throat. Chapter 12, Bronze Voices, Horns of the West and the Listening Hills. There are instruments made to please a hearth and instruments made to speak with the horizon. In these countries, the old metalworkers taught bronze to carry breath so far that a hill would answer. I have stood where cattle turn their heads all at once to the same sound, and where a valley seems to lean closer, as if it had ears. Some horns keep close to the chest. Long and gently curved, the bell round and plain, the seam of the sheet neatly riveted with the patience of winter work. Lift one and you feel the heft of cold mornings. The lip meets a cup that has read many mouths. The first note blooms like fog pushed by a slow hand. Such horns have slept in peaty ground near royal sites, pulled up in pairs, their plates still kissing at the joins, their bosses domed like small moons. When repaired and coaxed, they do not shriek. They pour. A single tone lays a path for feet to fall in step, for cattle to gather, for messages to cross a river without spilling into gossip. In the dusk below a hill of old kingship, one such voice can regularize the heart. Others rise like standards. Their boar-headed bells look down on men from a height greater than a shield held high. The tube climbs, bends, and climbs again, so that the mouth of the beast faces the same direction as the player's gaze. Teeth once grinned from bronze, and a tongue pan could tremble inside the jaw to give the sound a living edge. The smith chased bristles along the ridge and set eyes that would catch dawn. When breath fills such a thing, it does not flatter. It declares. The note is a long animal, half thunder, half iron, stepping out across heather and stone. Do not think only of battle. These voices called people to lawful gathering as surely as they stiffened a line. A horn on the ridge could announce the opening of the fair, or warn of a flood slipping its banks, or ask laborers to turn their spades to repair the causeway. Children learned what each phrase meant, as they learned smoke sign and bell. 3 long, 1 short, come to the green. A stare of rising notes, keep the cattle in. A held tone that leans then settles. The judge will speak at noon. Makers did not work alone. A sheet must be hammered until it thins without tearing, annealed and cooled and annealed again, the color passing from straw to dove to shadow and back. Edges are turned and riveted with little copper eyes. Bosses are raised from flat plate with blows that count their own meter. On the tall beasts' heads, plates meet along a seam that must be made arrogant and then hidden. The snout swallows the last of the tube, and the craftsman grins because the join is clean. A ladle of tin goes into the bronze just so, neither stingy nor reckless. Too little and the metal sulks under the hammer. Too much and it rings like glass and shatters his pride. I remember a field day when 2 horns answered one another from either side of a shallow valley. One was the low round kind, rich as a cow's contentment. The other, beast-headed and high, sent its tone like a spear of daylight. They were not at odds. The low voice laid a floor, the tall one built a roof. Between them 100 feet kept time, and the road to the fair was the proper width of a tune. Old men smiled because order had made a song and the song had made a road. In depictions hammered from far metal and in carvings on nearer stone, long throats of bronze stand among horsemen and standard-bearers, held at an angle that lets the bell look fate in the eye. Reliefs cut by foreign hands show such tubes in the grasp of northerners whose hair and cloaks move like field grass before weather. A cauldron made by masters who knew many styles shows beast heads rising from its rim, and a long trumpet sounding above a forest of spears. Even where the artists were not of this coast, the instruments found their place. The world recognized a voice built to cross borders. Horns had quiet work too. At night, a keeper walked the palisade and breathed a short phrase to tell his fellow on the next stretch that all was well. At lambing, a herder called 2 long notes and waited for a reply from the next valley to confirm that help was coming with fresh straw and a dry cloak. During rites by the river, when iron returned to water and vows to silence, a single tone held the people in a circle more surely than any rope could, each person's breath remembering to be slow and useful. When empire came pressing with square standards and brass of its own, the 2 musics listened to each other. The new horns were straight, their notes a command. The old ones kept their animal heads and their long curves like river paths. In some towns both sounded on the same morning. A decree read in the forum took its start from a foreign flourish. The fair that followed opened with a native call sweet as smoke. Craftsmen compared seams and sold each other wire and sheet under the table with the easy treason of those who respect skill wherever it stands. Time, which steals edges from stones, gentles metal too. Many horns sleep now in shadowed rooms. Their surfaces bloom with browns and greens the makers could not have imagined. When breath returns to them in careful hands, the old tones step out of the cabinets as if they had never been away. Dogs lift their heads. Sheep take 2 slow steps toward one another without quite knowing why. A child laughs, feels the sound in her ribs, and thinks, that is a road I could walk. If you wish to keep company with these voices, do not stand too close. Let the valley do its work. Find a place where the wind will not meddle and listen for the first rising of the note from the ground under your boots. It will arrive through soil and then through bone and only then through air. When it fades, you will hear quieter things more clearly. A wheel easing on its axle, a bee's temper in the gorse, the early rattle of a cart coming over the brow. Common music that the bronze only made room for. Now our circle is wider by 2 rooms. One of edges that teach a name how to stand upright in the wind, and one of voices that lift a valley into agreement. The night is nearly spent. Keep what serves you, letters on a spine, breath in a tube, the way both ask for steadiness, and let the rest go to the fields that grew them. When you are ready, we may walk again, perhaps to kitchens and dyes, or to coins that hold small horses within their rims. For this hour, rest. The hills will keep listening. The stones will keep their edges. Chapter 13, Stones that Keep the Sun. The chalk roads to Stonehenge. Chalk remembers the feet that ask things of it. It bruises white under heel and wheel. It takes a clean edge from antler picks, and it keeps the ghost of a path long after grass tries to forget. On a broad plain where larks stitch daylight together, a ring of stones learned, very early, to listen to the sky. Long before iron sang in the forges, when timber still held councils and rivers carried more news than roads, people here raised a house for the sun and taught stone to answer light. The work began in a gentler register. A wide ditch and bank bitten from the chalk with picks of red deer antler, the spoil thrown inward until it made a low white wall. Within that white ring, small, tidy pits circled the ground. Holes that would later cradle posts or hold the ashes of men and women returned to powder by careful fire. For a time, this place was a cemetery of respect, a crown of quiet around the living. Even now, when sheep graze without ceremony and tourists tread the trodden path, the air keeps that first hush if you stand still enough. Later, the monument took on its elder grammar of stone. From the north came blocks of sarsen, the tough sandstone of the downs, walked and sledged across land for a day's journey and more. Some 20 miles of coaxing and rope, of sweat and oaths spoken between teeth so the children would not learn new language. From the far west came the darker, denser stones the people knew as foreign even then. The blue stones, speckled and close-grained, lifted from hills that taste of salt wind and more, ferried and hauled by patience rather than by miracle. Their long travel was itself a kind of ritual. To move such mass without metal is to decide, together, that the future deserves ceremony. The sarsens took the circle's outer measure, paired uprights joined by lintels so exact that the meeting edges were shaped with mortise and tenon, the top scarfed together with a tongue and groove that would have made a boat builder proud. You can still see the swell worked into the columns, the faint emphasis that keeps tall things from looking sullen. Along the inner ring, the blue stones learned new positions more than once, as the monument's mind changed and refined itself. In the circle's horseshoe, 5 great trilithons rose, the tallest standing above a person as a beech stands above a hedge. Heave a lintel, settle it, dress it until it runs like water along the top. Each act made structure into thought. Outside the bank, a single monstrous block watched the horizon. It leans now, as old watchers do, but its face still keeps the line where the hottest day's sun lifts and enters the circle's attention. The people named it for heels and for standing, but it is a finger pointing to a yearly promise. Between that stone and the ring ran a broad, chalk-bright way, an avenue whose parallel banks guide the body as the lintels guide the eye. Follow it outward and you find river scent. Follow it inward and you arrive at a door sized for the sun. This is the secret that is not a secret. The place answers the solstices. On the long day, the sun shoulders itself above the fields and walks through the formal mouth. On the short day, when the world contracts to breath and bread and keeping warm, the last light slides along the same grammar toward the circle's heart. Some think the summer rising is the purpose, some the winter's red farewell. I have stood for both and will tell you what the bones in the chalk already know. Winter matters most. People gathered then at houses of timber nearer the river, roasted meat whose bones tell of cold season slaughter, sang until breath made white flowers in the dark, and walked the chalk way to watch the sun acquit itself of dying. The summer promise is joy, the winter proof is relief. The chalkland round about is not empty stage. A long, narrow earthwork lies north like a white bone laid on the plain. The cursus, older than the stones, its purpose not a command but a question that has lived well for a very long time. Nearer the river stand the circles of timber where everyday laughter found its season. Rings of posts that held roofs and railings, feasts and sleep, the clatter of pots and the steady rhythm of 1,000 small tasks. To the east a quieter ring once sat right by the water. Its small stones later walked away to learn their new parts within the great house, a rearrangement that is both thrift and theology. Across the fields, barrows swell like green drums, each with its own person and its own story of a world that had learned bronze and liked the way it shone. I have watched the building happen with winter eyes. Antler picks lift chalk in clean bites and leave the ditch shining. Men and women with shoulders like yokes haul sledges, their weight set low, their steps counted in songs. Water greases the track. Rollers move forward, backward, forward again. A patient pulse that carries a block the length of a long sleep. At the rising site, pit's weight already measured by rope and rod. The first upright goes into its socket with chalk packed around its foot like a midwife's hands. The second stands to meet it. The lintel walks up a ramp of earth and timbers as if it were a polite guest being presented to a lord. When the ramp is shaved away and the lintel floats, the company sees what it has made. A door that answers the oldest light. In later years, the circle changed outfits. Some stones were moved inward or outward, some dressed again. A ring of small holes received posts for reasons the air has kept to itself. An outer ring of pits marked a boundary that eyes respect even now. The place learned to speak with fewer words as it grew older, trimming its ornaments until only the grammar remained. That is how the best houses behave when they find their purpose. People fetched more than stone to this chalk floor. They brought their dead by fire first, and carried the gray remnant in bags or boxes that names have forgotten. Then tucked those ashes into the clean pits along the ring so that the house would hold family as well as son. They came later with hair dressed for a rite, with beads that held a sea in miniature, with bracelets bright enough to be seen from a mound away. A man rode from far places and was buried not on the chalk itself but within sight of it. His grave rich with the first snarl of metal, his teeth story telling of journeys wider than a winter. The stones did not scorn any of this. They are generous hosts. Foreign soldiers, long afterward, drew this ring on their tablets as they marched elsewhere, noting that the locals loved circles even when Rome's roads preferred line and angle. Antiquaries paced the bank and argued about giants and conjurers, about devils who dropped stones like dice. Later, men in hats measured with chains and drew with pencils. Then spades spoke and notebooks overflowed. Trenches were opened and closed again, not always kindly, not always well. Yet the place endures because it was built with the right partnership. Sky's will and human will in balance. Chalk's patience and hands' refusal to hurry the parts that cannot be hurried. Listen for the tools still singing in the cuts. On the faces of the Sarsens, a field of tiny peck marks clothes the stone in a pelt of work. Run your palm along the lintel's underside and you will feel a smoothness granted by thousands of blows that chose precision over haste. Peer at the joint where two lintels meet and you will see the shy seam where tongue enters groove, a kindness that keeps the circle's crown from drifting. These are not accidents. They are the remains of instruction. Master to apprentice, aunt to niece, how to draw a straight line on chalk, how to square a corner without a carpenter's square, how to count to the right number of men for a pull that must not fail. The place is not a fossil. It breeds arrangements. In the deep of winter, modern folk still gather beyond the rope and wait for the red coin to slip along the Sarsens. In high summer, they throw long shadows and remember to be quiet for once. Owls use the lintels as perches when crowds have gone. Sheep scratch against the uprights with the same entitlement kings once felt. Skylarks rise and hang, their little hearts drumming like the feet of a crew hauling rope. If you wish to know the ring as its builders did, do not hunt for secrets beyond the ones the sun already teaches. Walk the avenue from the river before dawn and let the chalk take your steps. Pause at the great single stone and allow your eyes to learn the horizon's grammar. Enter where the door opens and stand in the cool breath of sarsen shade while the day considers you. The place will tell you what it knows. That light is a traveler with good manners. That winter asks for patience and rewards it. That community is a machine not of gears but of hands. And that chalk is a trustworthy page for any people who intend to remember themselves. Stonehenge, the later world calls it. The old names have gone down into the ditches with the antler picks, but the work still speaks their sense. It is a ring that makes time visible, a house for a blade of light, a chair for patience, a rule written without ink. When you leave it, walk away backward for a few steps the way one does from a door where elders sit. Not out of superstition, out of courtesy. The chalk will blur your heels to white, the larks will stitch the morning shut, and the stones will go on with their long lesson, which is the kind worth learning slowly. So we have walked the round, from lake patterns hammered into iron to a bronze tablet that keeps the moons wandering in order, from sanctuaries where weapons learned to be harmless to a headland that stored its brightness in the ground, from a grove where law lived in memory to the roadside where God smiled beneath more than one name. From vellum pages that saved heroes for evening lamps to gates of the year that taught work when to begin and when to rest. From the Peat's long, exact kindness to a winter sun that remembers its appointment with stone. If these paths have eased your breathing, let them remain near. The old world asks little of us, only that we mind our promises, give beauty away on purpose now and then, and keep a steady watch for the moment when darkness makes room for a blade of light. When night returns, I will be here, where rivers bend and stones remember, ready to walk again with you through the quiet that keeps the world together.